Okay, everybody, what we are going to do is explore the differences between vector and raster data structures. Okay, so we are going to further explore in more detail vector data on Wednesday and rasters on Wednesday and probably into Friday, but for now, let's just get a basic sense of how these two things are different by looking at how we work with them in ArcMap, which is the main software we will be using for this course. Okay, so we've loaded our raster data here into ArcMap, and let's just zoom out a little bit. Okay, and you can see that we have Guelph here, so we're in Guelph, and remember that this is a raster of land cover information. Okay, so if we zoom in, one of the key things I'll notice here is it looks pixelated, as one of you pointed out in class today. Okay, and so as you can see, we've got different squares here. Let's zoom in even a little bit more. Okay, so each one of these squares represents a 30 by 30 meter classification of land cover. Okay, so how do we know what each of these colors represents? Well, one of the main things you're going to be working with or drawing on, relying on in ArcMap is the table of contents. So this is like kind of a legend for when you're working in ArcMap, okay? So let's go to our layer of data here, and here it is. And here's the legend for that. So we have a bunch of different numbers here, and as we talked about in class, those numbers in a raster, those integers, stand in for a category. In this case, a category of land cover, but in other cases it might be a category of um, other kinds of things you can think of. Temperature, elevation, that sort of thing. But land cover is a pretty common one, okay? And so, 185, for instance, right here, 192, these are going to represent different kinds of land covers. Okay, and if we had the metadata associated with this file, okay, that would tell us what 192 actually means, what land cover it actually is. Okay, we can get a little bit more detail by opening the attribute table for this file. Okay, so this is our way of accessing in ArcMap the database associated with our raster file loaded here. Okay, so what we see is a pretty small table here. Okay, when we right click here and go to open attribute table, this is what we get for our raster. We have about 47 rows and 3 columns. So this first column is essentially just a number, okay, in order. But this second column is the value, okay? And this value corresponds to the integers over here for different land cover types. So remember, we have integers representing different land cover types, such as 50, okay? And it's here. Now this count is telling us how many cells, how many pixels are representing that land cover type. So it turns out there's 117 million, I think it is, cells or pixels with the land cover type 50, which we'll see in a second what 50 actually stands for, what land cover type. Okay? So I can actually click on that row and highlight all of the cells in our file that are land cover type 50. Okay? I can't select individual cells. So I'm now using another important tool here, which is called the Select Features tool. I can't select individual features. Let me clear that old selection and try to select individual cells. I can't do it, but I can select an entire group of cells. So the way that rasters, the ones that we'll be working with in this course at least, function is that they group together cells or pixels with a common integer or value. So all the 50s are together, all the 80s are together, and so on and so forth. All right. I can identify a specific cell. So for instance, if I use the identify tool here, I can go and identify the value associated with that cell and learn that it's land cover type 34, but I can't actually select it. I can't grab a hold of it, if you will. And that's very different than vector data. Okay, so let's go see what our vector data looks like. So it's up here in our layers, list of layers. Whoa. And we're so far zoomed in that all of a sudden we can't really see where we are. So let's zoom out a little more using the zoom tool up here. And you can see now, instead of having a whole bunch of different pixels and cells, we have areas, okay? So unlike a raster file, which is gridded into cells of the same size, vectors are comprised of points, lines, and polygons. Okay, so we can have polygons of any kind of shape. Okay. We can also, as you can see, we've got a bit more detail. So vectors can hold more attribute information for us. And in this case, they're telling us a little bit about what those land cover types are. So it turns out 50 actually represents shrubland. Okay. We can also select individual shapes in this case. So again, we're using the select tool here. And you can see that I've selected this shape. So it's one big massive clump of a particular land cover type. Okay. We also can open the attribute table for vector data. So right click on the layer here, and we'll open the attribute table. And the first thing you'll notice is we have a lot more information in the raster. Okay, we still got rows and columns, but we have a lot more rows. Why is that? Because every single shape here is its own entity. It's its own row, and we can select it. So we've already selected a shape on the map. We can filter to that in our table. So you can see that its ID is it's the 7,309 shape in this data. Its land cover type is 122, which if we go to our little legend here is perennial cropland. Okay, and we also have some other qualitative and quantitative data here. So we have another kind of ID, another name, but also some quantitative information. We've got other numbers here concerning accuracy. But we could have other sorts of quantitative and qualitative data here in the vector as well. Okay. So as you can see with vector data, unlike raster, we can select individual units. We can have a bit more quantitative and qualitative data. Okay. We can also identify each shape. So we use the identify tool again up here. And essentially, as you can see, it's kind of flashed, highlighted. Essentially, we're just looking at that row in the attribute table in a different way. It's all the same information, just provided here in the identify window. Okay. So these are some of the main differences that we'll work with between vector and raster data. Okay, and we'll explore those more on Wednesday.